this just a blip or the beginning of the end for the Australian coal industry? Well, Grant Howard has more than a passing interest in that answer. He is a coal miner in the Bowen Basin in Queensland, one of Australia's largest coal reserves. Wonderful to see you.
Great.
Talk to me about how long you have been a coal miner.
Look, I've been in the industry about 38, 39 years. I started in the Illawarra, worked there for 22 years and then was retrenched from there and moved to central Queensland, where I've been working for the last 18 years.
Okay, and what worries you? Losing your job as a coal miner, the warming planet, or both?
Yeah, well, absolutely both. And indeed, as a coal miner, I've also participated in some climate activism. You know, I recognise the concerns around climate change. I'm a coal miner and certainly went out of my way to try and understand the circumstances better, because I was a coal miner, and what it meant for me and the people that I worked with in the industry. In that exploration, what I learnt was that politicians are indeed letting us down. You know, global resource companies are making a transition. They understand the market better than anyone. Coal miners understand the resource they're mining, whether it be thermal coal or metallurgical coal. They understand the market to a certain degree as well. And in all of that, though, politicians were indeed just letting us down. And so that's where I decided to be, where I could play a part, perhaps, in understanding more about in terms of mine workers and developing a platform for mine workers to stand on and be part of that discussion.
So, my head's spinning. I'm sure everybody at home is struggling to keep up. You're digging up the black stuff, and you're also standing with people who are climate change campaigners, and you're an activist in that space. I mean, how do you do both?
Yeah, well, it was a circumstance which I had to develop and understand. You know, I clearly, I learned about climate change 40 years ago at school. I went to work as a coal miner thinking that the government would, do the right thing and look after our environment. And the simple fact is that 40 years later, they have totally failed to look after our environment. So, I went through that process of crystallising all that, and then reconciled my circumstances and understood what it meant for me and the people I work for. And indeed, that is the fact that we will be part of a transition. In fact, you know, the transition is underway, and it's obvious that it's underway given all of the activities that governments, the state governments particularly, are planning for. Joel
Fitzgibbon has just quit Labor's front bench, saying that Labor's demonising coal miners by pursuing net zero. So what do you want to hear from politicians?
What I want to hear, and what coal miners, I've worked with coal miners for 38 years, and they're resourceful people. They have a degree of dexterity. They're adaptable. What they really what they need is the truth. And
what's that?
The truth is that, when you burn 1 tonne of thermal coal, you get 2 tonnes of carbon dioxide or thereabouts. Joel Fitzgibbon wants to sort of rattle around in some sort of argy-bargy that Australian coal is, there's some future in it because it's cleaner coal, or China will buy our coal, or, let's all work together. Indeed, that's what I want. I want coal miners to work together with the rest of Australia in transitioning to a cleaner future. And that, coal mining is not going to stop tomorrow, and no activist has ever said that. In fact, I sort of took exception to Joel when he said that, he felt coal miners were being demonised. Coal miners don't feel demonised, they feel anxious, and that anxiety is produced because there is no plan. And at the moment, the federal government still has no plan. I'm disappointed that, the Labor Party was indeed putting a platform together. They were outlining a target, a 2050 target of zero carbon emissions, and I thought that was great. We're starting to put something together, and then Joel, sort of out of the blue, comes up to play spoiler.
This is not black or white. It's not coal mining versus climate change.
Well, it is, isn't it? I mean, you can't do both. I mean, if what the Economist today is saying is correct, we need to transition away from coal. It needs to happen as quickly as possible. And Emma's just made the point on the science. I mean, it really is one of those either-ors, isn't it?
Well, I don't think it is, and I think that's what Grant's trying to say. I think that Grant's probably a pretty lonely person in the crib hut, Grant, I imagine. But, I think that when you're coming to the the end of your career as well, it must be a lot easier to, stand with climate change activists and talk about shutting down an industry. Particularly once you...
Look, I totally disagree with what you're saying. In fact, I'm not a lonely person at work. In fact, I was retrenched a month ago along with 50 other people, so I fully understand the implications for mine workers in a changing industry. I worked in coal mines in the Illawarra when there was a far greater transition or a far greater rationalisation in the 80s and 90s. I saw a lot of coal miners retrenched and changed their jobs and changed their circumstances. Indeed, a lot of coal miners left New South Wales and went to Queensland. So I fully understand the circumstances for coal miners, and at the end of my career, I still have plenty of skin in the game. I want our communities to go ahead. I want our communities to prosper. I want Australia as a country to be up in the top 10 of the world in terms of how we deal with climate change and for whatever we want to do. So, no, I don't accept that being at the end of my career it's easy to stand in line with other activists. I stand in line with other activists because the simple fact is we need to transition to a zero carbon future. And politicians, what particularly got me involved was the simple fact of that sort of rhetoric that, everything's going to be okay, and I'm particularly disappointed by the circumstance that politicians have led us to.
I'm sorry, but, at the end of the day, we're not talking about transitioning any time in the near future. And what people want to hear and what coal miners want to hear out where I live is that we've got governments that back them in their job today for safe, secure work. And that was absolutely what we saw in the result for the federal election. The Labor government didn't do that. The Labor government stayed quiet on coal. They didn't actually come to back coal mine workers, and that was absolutely reflected in the result. And forgive me, I can't look past the hypocrisy of on one hand being paid by a mining company and on the other hand campaigning to shut it down.
No, and so you're using the rhetoric right there of shutting things down. That's exactly the flannel that politicians
that's what transition is.
No.
That's transition.
Well, no, it isn't.
So what?
It absolutely is not.
So what is transition?
A better example, Ellen, would be the Hunter Valley. That's the topical situation at the moment. They mine thermal coal. So I actually had a drive around the Hunter Valley yesterday. What an amazing place it is, and I was sort of annoyed with myself that I hasn't visited there earlier. Front of shop in the Hunter Valley is an amazingly beautiful place with sort of where there were some old underground coal mines, and is quite an amazing scenic place. I went to the drive out to the back of the Hunter Valley where I saw a lot of big holes in the ground and a really big incinerator. Typical of the place where I grew up in Wollongong, where we had this thing called the Illawarra power station. And by the way, Wollongong seems to have done quite well out of moving from where they were as an iron steel industry and a coal mining hub to where they are today. An amazingly vibrant and prosperous community where I can't even afford to buy a house. So I sort of don't accept this whole idea that we're shutting things down. It's all about a transition, and what federal politicians can do is give us the plan, and they haven't got one right now. So an example is Joel Fitzgibbon. I drove around, and my first thoughts were, what is a transition for this place, the Hunter Valley? And it didn't take me long to think about that. The first step was to be honest with coal miners, explain the circumstances, get them included in the discussion. The next thing was to identify opportunities, and you're right, it's thermal coal, and then there's metallurgical coal. Now there's 5 new metallurgical coal mines planned for the Bowen Basin, haven't opened yet. I watched the retrenchments in the Illawarra through the 80s, through the 90s, and at some point, and look, I took a job in the coal industry because I didn't have a choice. It was the only job I had. It comes to a point as a person, when you're trying to look after your family and trying to look after your mortgage, that you'll do whatever you have to do to cater for those circumstances, and coal miners will do that. They are resourceful people. They have a degree of dexterity. They understand the circumstances, and all they need is the truth. And what they want is a plan. And so that's what I see missing here. New South Wales, if I might just sort of bring that into play, was just announced a $32 billion plan to transition in 10 years, shutting down 4 or 5 power stations. Now, out of that, that's the Liberal state government, Liberal Party attending to these issues. The opposition, the Labor Party, bought into that and said, well, what about we make sure that there are jobs there for these local communities. Good move. That's what I'd like to hear. And what Joel could have said was that instead of mine workers being demonised, he could have said, and by the way, that's my area, the Hunter Valley. What are we doing for the Hunter Valley with that for that $32 billion? And there is a really simple answer for what a transition's all about.
Yeah.
I mean, the main point is the longer we keep our head in the sand, the harder it is to transition and the more pain we feel. So I think what we're asking for is a plan. We're asking for a plan that started 20 years ago. Now we've got 7.5 years left, and every year that we leave it behind, and every year we're overly optimistic about the industries that are clearly having to shut down, we make it harder for the communities. We make it harder to reskill, to retrain, to mobilise, to invest in those new technologies. And so I think speed is of the essence here, absolutely, in order to enable any form of just transition.